I'm Deborah McLeod, Senior Director at Gagosian in Beverly Hills, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to a conversation between artist Katharina Grosse and scholar Graham Bader. Katharina Grosse lives and works in her native Berlin as well as New Zealand. In her practice, she blurs the lines between painting, sculpture, and performance, and she has expanded the scope and potential of painting through breathtaking scale, even using buildings and landscapes as her canvas, and her intense working method of the airless spray gun, making color itself her medium. Katharina's compositions are performative and intuitive, but grounded in keen analysis. Her chosen medium of spray paint is a tool for calculated improvisation and a catalyst to reactions between material, support, mind, eye, and hand. Katharina's work is in the permanent collection of many museums around the world, including the Albright Knox, the Centre Pompidou, the Maxi in Rome, and the Museum of Modern Art, among many others. Katharina's stunning and ambitious exhibition, Repetitions Without Origin, is on view at Gagosian, Beverly Hills, through October 23rd. It is her fourth with the gallery. Dr. Graham Bader has his PhD from Harvard University and is Associate Professor of Art History at Rice University, where he is Department Chair, Modern and Contemporary Art. Graham has published widely on topics across the spectrum of modern and contemporary art and is a renowned Roy Lichtenstein scholar, having authored Hall of Mirrors, Roy Lichtenstein and the Face of Painting in the 1960s. His most recent book, Poisoned Abstraction, Kurt Schwitter's Between Revolution and Exile, will be out with Yale University Press this fall, so stay tuned for that. Katharina and Graham had special time together this summer in Berlin, when Graham, as American Fellow at the Academy in Berlin, had the privilege of visiting the paintings that are on view now in our gallery in their studio habitat in Berlin. I think that's quite special. Without further ado, Graham and Katharina.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction, Deb, and good to see you again, Katharina. Not face-to-face in Berlin, but face-to-face via Zoom. So let me start, Katharina, if we can, looking at the works that are up now in Los Angeles and thinking of these images of early works that you sent my way. This one of the raw canvas suspended in the woods in Germany that we see here, 1982, so very, very early. And then a later piece, 1989, that you directed me to here with these leaves sort of embedded in this thickly applied paint. And thinking about these two early works and looking now at the works that are up at the gallery, I was thinking like this here, where we have this cut and sprayed canvas, or where you have a fragment of a tree literally sort of knotted together with that canvas. So you have this decades-long sort of working between the space of painting, the fact of painting, and the natural environment, going from a canvas sort of in nature to nature embedded in paint, to hear this literal entwining of the two, or in that cut canvas, the work itself becomes some kind of purely natural thing there in the world before us. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that relationship specifically, or also these general terms of culture, nature, how you think of those two and how those have informed your practice in sort of relation with one another.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and also so many questions are embedded in that one thought. But as we were talking about how to introduce this show that is on display in Los Angeles, I was thinking maybe to look at my very early work when I was just starting to paint. I started to paint very late, so the thing you just showed with the white foam within the twigs in the forest, I made that just in my first year. And what I started to understand, that I've always been interested in intertwining something that comes from my activity that would take place while I do something else, that is maybe painting, and from my everyday life, and how that would come into my thinking when I would deal with the tradition of painting, with easel painting with, I painted landscapes, I painted people, I painted things I fantasized about. And, so I went through all possibilities, but there were always moments when I tried to intertwine something that you could name, that you could refer to. Everybody knows a leaf, everybody knows a twig. It's not something that needs a theoretical introduction. And then you confront it with something that has no naming method, that is not addressing a referential or any kind of reproductive imagery, for example. And I liked to find out whether these two things give each other something that the other doesn't have.
Yeah. So it reminded me of Jasper Johns, actually, sort of this thing that everybody knows that's right there, which I hadn't thought of before in relation to your work. But in terms of those early pieces, there is something there, actually, that sort of facticity of the thing. What's interesting, though, again, is this cut canvas where it has become this kind of tentacled, hanging thing, a natural element in the universe, rather than, again, a contained space of composition, of fixed representation. So maybe if I can ask to sort of broaden out a little bit, to think about this issue of sort of mining borders, of working between zones, working between different kinds of elements in different spaces of experience.
If there is a gap between the elements that I like to move towards one another, this gap is, and if that gap is maintained, so if the two things aren't negotiated, or if the two things aren't kind of intertwined into a compositional endeavor, which I think in Jones' work you do have that, but if you have them bluntly next to or into one another, then you kind of maintain the gap, and the gap is a really great space because it is something that urges you to, you have to make a leap either from one side to the other or into the zone. So you have to risk something when you look at the work in a certain sense. That was my experience. And also, I think the two things, if they're not negotiated to look alike or look towards, but still having their own zone, then you have a certain, and they endanger one another. I think they destroy one another in a certain way. So the leaves even take the oil paint away and mark space, they claim space in the painting. And I mean, the same with the slashes in the canvas you just showed, where the canvas is cut into different layers, like a pastry might be cut, there is a certain, it's not just a destruction, but it's also, you take something apart, as if you have a radio and you take it apart to see how it works. In that kind of direction, I would classify destruction,
Yeah, I do think, again, looking at your work sort of across the board, you talk about sort of two things next to each other with a gap so that they really are, there's not a hierarchical relationship. They're put in a sort of suspended opposition with one another. And that is something that across your work I see really present in the way that you use space, the way that space is active within your paintings. There are layers of space one can see. We see it in some of these current works. We can look at those in a second, but there's no resolution between this sits on top of that or this is privileged over that. What I wanted to ask you about in relation to what you were just discussing, so the leaves in canvases, in the paint, the kind of negation that is present there, but then also in the cut canvas in the current piece. Those works also seem to work differently in that the cut canvas there's a sense of sort of speed to that. There's a sense of aggression, both in terms of the speed of the act of spraying. There's a sense of sort of slashing, of a kind of emphatic cut here. Even as it's very composed, it's very careful, but there's a sense of speed, a sense of a kind of maybe aggression here. If we look at the other piece with the leaves, that seems very different. There's a kind of almost loving sort of nestling of those within the surface of the paint. I notice seeing it right in front of us now, there are of course hearts as well, which I don't know if that was at all in your mind. But so I guess there's a number of things there that are at play. This notion of sort of the speed of work and the differences here, but also a play again between a kind of aggressive sort of taking away or cutting into and a kind of embrace or nestling in, as we see here.
Yeah, that is quite true. And I think this very early work with the leaves is from a time where I was touching the canvas directly. You know, I was touching it with a paintbrush that kind of leaves the traces and gives that kind of light effect as well, which I admire with soulage, for example. And then you put these little leaves in, and even into the wet paint, you tuck them in a sense. So everything was about touch. And the touch on a canvas is like a moment where you are marking a time sequence here and there. And it is, you can almost feel the touch of it, the body, the feeling of your fingers on a leaf, maybe in oily, muddy surfaces. Whereas the spray has led me to something where I'm not touching the work with my fingers or with my body, but with just the outcome of the yaga. So there is a certain activity in front of the canvas that is developing maybe a green or a yellow, and then the residue of that is actually touching then the surface. And also it made me much faster. The spray gun is a very fast tool. I can also be enlarged by it. It creates a distance towards the canvas or the support on which I paint. It makes me almost double the size, you know, with the tools I have. And therefore I have another speed, another size, and another volume at hand. And that is a very compelling and very different working method. So you're right, the direct body relationship with the work has gone since a long time, and I have replaced it with very thin films, surfaces of color, because I realized that the color is more vibrant if it's really thin, and I find there is something very ambiguously brilliant about color being so thin and yet so direct and flamboyant.
Here, Katharina, we have another cut piece with a great expanse of wall exposed, and then we have a broader spray piece on the wall behind, where here now you can see sort of these smaller marks of these pinned elements that are across the painting surface, have been painted over and then taken away. This seems to me, again, an interesting case of your work with space and also with speed, which is to say that you have these broad sprays, but then you have these sort of snaking elements across them that are in a different space, are really at a different speed as well. They're sort of static there. And of course, they're absent, but the traces of their absence are there because one can see the pinpricks where what was there was attached to it. So again, let me ask you, I'd love to hear about your procedure as you were sort of working with these diverse elements and the kind of decisions that guided your work on a painting like that we see on the far wall.
Yeah, I mean, the decisions on that painting are very often also within a chain of many decisions I've made on other paintings at the same time. So that's maybe an interesting thing. So I make a decision on painting A, and then maybe it influences decision on painting B. You know, so that's, I paint on a lot of things at the same time. Sometimes I'm not even really clearly aware where the paintings stop, you know, or how at the beginning I'm not making a choice how they should be different. And then this I think in these paintings there are twigs or branches I put onto the surface first. They, for me, are something like the scale of real time, or, you know, a branch can't be enlarged. It is like, it is what it is. And even when you take it away after the painting process, the trace it leaves gives you a certain clarity of a real, let's call it a one-to-one experience of scale, material, and presence. Whereas the painting can change its, or the color in that kind of movement, and the movements are indeed quite fast. And I paint the paintings over very fast. So I paint the painting maybe over during the day 4, 5, 6 times, and then I do it again the next day, or maybe 2 days later. So you have a lot of stacks of very fast movements in a certain sense. And stacking up those fast movements, they compress the time in a most interesting way. It is not only that we like to describe as the linearity is gone, you know, like you flip the pages of a book or you have a movie from A to Z. So it annihilates beginning and end in a sense, but it also gives you a space of, as if you store energy in a battery, you know.
Yeah.
It's like that kind of movement. And I think that is a certain life force that I'm fascinated by. And when you were talking about that it looks wild or uncontrolled, maybe even the word, I think it refers to that life energy that I'm fascinated by and that I try to experience when I work. And then when I look at the painting, I think there is something about it. It's very different from what I experience when I work, right? So, but so looking at the work at the end for me is as well gives me a totally different image of my work.
It's also, and you see it in this shot very nicely, this interesting way that the canvas and the color that's on this canvas also pools onto the ground here. So this interest in sort of the thingness, the theirness of your painting. And this is something where, I mean, across your sort of canvas-based work, you know, I see all kinds of dialogue with your very large scale in situ pieces, which is to say, in both of them, there's sort of this, what I call a kind of theirness of the painted mark. You know, when you see one of your expansive environmental pieces, it's not that you read it, you take it apart, you look at it as an image. Rather, it is just there. You pass through this landscape of color, of incident. But also in these works, and I guess it's coming, you know, into my comments through the cut piece, there's something similar there as well, which is to say, and this goes together with what you said before, they're not ideas of anything, they're not ideologies, they're not, you know, analyses of X, Y, or Z, but they are these very specific things that are there before us, that are tied into a history of painting, that are tied into a expanded practice of painting as you are pursuing it. I guess I'm not posing a question, I'm sort of thinking through.
Yeah, but it's also maybe what you're addressing is how do I actually make these works? Because they have also very different needs of time. For example, that very large painting here on the left-hand side is, I definitely painted on it for a long time. And then the slashed piece, I made a lot of them, but it didn't take long to make them, in a sense that I elaborate on them to test and find out. But they are a version of a thought, what if, while I paint the green piece, you know. So there is a lot of these things in my mind, and the paintings don't go very far away from one another, because they are very, very, I mean, they're a little bit like a family of thought. But yeah. I don't hesitate to step away from a certain sibling, let's say. I mean, if you would look at other works of that show, because that is the first room where we could show these large paintings. But then in the second room, I have these works where you have another slash painting in a group of works that have missing areas as well, but they are not as linear or like as branchy as the ones in the first room, but they are very, very difficult to understand what forms they are. They are difficult to portray or to describe. They are just in the way of the color repetition, in a sense. So they're very irregular color repetition coming into the work, as if coming from somewhere else as well. So the activity is coming from outside the work. And it hits on something that's not there anymore, but that it actually disturbs the smooth movement. And the cutting the canvas is also in that same way an experience of disturbing an unfiltered movement. So the painting has always to go to some sort of filter that is like even an obstacle or a in the way. You know, so as if you have a little piece of dust in your eye.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's sort of a nice set of observations maybe to work towards wrapping up, and that I think back to the earlier works with which we started, where it's this bringing of nature into the works, or the work in nature. And here the way you're discussing these works is as this set of elements that disturb one another, that impact one another. And so this idea of painting, as you pursue it, as I don't want to say, sort of something that is like a meeting of different elements, and through that an opening up of certain channels, and to see what is created out of that, rather than, again, the idea of I want to fix this image, or I want to tell this story, but a kind of constant dialogue, a constant conversation, a constant upsetting of different elements, including the multiple sets of works you're working on at one time, as you say.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right.
That was a fantastic amount of information in 30 minutes. Thank you both so much. Thank you for your insightful questions, Graham, and for being so forthcoming, as always, Katharina. It's just amazing how much one learns every time you speak. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And thanks to our audience, too, for being with us today. If you have questions about the artworks that you saw, you can write to collecting@gagosian.com and ask questions. And please subscribe to our newsletter so you can stay up to date on events like this one. So thanks so much, everyone. See you next time. And special thanks, Graham and Katharina.
I wanted to meet up again via Zoom just because I was excited to sort of walk through your show in Los Angeles, virtually, and to spend some time looking more at individual works, thinking about process, thinking about some of the decisions that went into making those works. And I wonder if we want to start just by kind of entering into the first gallery of the show. And I'd love to hear from you a little bit about sort of the conception of the show and the ideas behind this body of work.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We have two rooms in Los Angeles that are very different, and they have fantastic daylight. And I had been painting had been following three very different strands of thinking in my portable paintings over the last Christmas until even late April. And I was really tempted to show them all together because I had developed them together. So in my studio in New Zealand, I can paint outdoors. And these very large paintings that we see here, I painted outdoors. So I just stapled the canvas to the outside of my house there, which is on a cliff on the west coast of Auckland. And I painted on those canvases for 3-4 months even. And this is also a little bit the reason for the title, which is Repetitions Without Origin. So I was watching myself working, and these large, very easygoing movements I can do with my spray gun, which are actually not lines, but they are radiant tangents of a circle in a sense, helped me to stack paint on top of one another and color layers on top of one another that would generate a very interesting space by repeating a certain movement, but yet deviating from the first movement. Yeah. So also the size, very much a size that matches the outdoor feel. For example, the unlimited, not, I wasn't painting in an indoor room that was contained, but it was very open also to the sky. So
in these large scale works, the scale is both a product of that context of painting outdoors, but also more than just produced by that context, it sounds like, but also that scale becomes somehow evocative of that outdoor space in which you're painting.
Yeah, it is also generating the question, how does the painting or the painting process behave in relationship to the given size of the canvas? So, because then there was the wall, then there is the canvas, and then there's my movement, and how do these three components influence one another. That is the thing that I enjoy outdoors. So you have a lot, except apart from that, you have the daylight changing and the wind and the weather. But you do behave to the canvas in a different way. And I like to see that the painting activity is independent from the surface on which it lands. And that's why you have these somehow these movements that seem to slip away from the surface into another space that is behind or beyond the given canvas.
Can I ask you, Katharina, so much of how you're describing these paintings, movement and different iterations and different sort of conditions of movement are at the center of what you're describing. And then you have these sort of superimposed elements that have been painted over. In these cases, correct me if I'm wrong, it's twigs, right, that you've attached to the canvas. So those are sort of static. Those are pinned, those are literally held in place. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that relation between this emphatic, and we see it when we look at these works, movement, centrality of movement to the spray, and then that static quality of those elements that you've painted over and then removed from these canvases.
Yeah, I think you've put it really well. It's there from the first moment. Before I paint, I put all those twigs on and I'd really nail them to the ground, or I nail them to the wall, So I have wooden walls, I can put nails in so that they get really very tight and tucked in on the, and the canvas is actually being squished even by those branches, and almost as if I want to make them really stay on the surface, So the painting then that goes over the whole thing is very soft. There is a softness to the way that I apply the colors. The colors on top of one another are very soft and very related to one another. They mix very, very well. But the harshness of these twigs, they are almost as if they're a filter or a sawn structure, or even maybe like a knife that cuts through the developing painting. So they continuously stay in touch with the primed canvas, and they will, once I remove them, show again the primed canvas underneath. So they're a little bit like slots or opened lids in a certain way to a space that is very real, that is very factual, that is the woven fabric with primer on top.
On some of these, in the sort of more exposed portions of the canvas, you see the sort of loose canvas where before it was stretched, it caught the spray and then you've stretched. So again, it's this interesting moment where pictorially it's sort of illusionistic now that it's stretched, but what you see is the sort of factual situation of that canvas as it is loose in the act of painting, if you know the elements I'm mentioning.
Yeah, you're talking about the creases that come about once you spray against something a little wobbly, and then
exactly.
It portrays, the spray kind of like dust portrays and enhances the sculptural surface of the situation. Now that's true. You have in these paintings many different, if you want, status of being, so there is the portrait in a sense, or the rendering of a woven canvas, but there is also then the stretching. There are the twigs that are like cuts into the painted surface, and then there is the pictorial space that again does not really behave itself in unison with the given canvas. So you have a lot of different activities or partners that constitute the painting, and they all have their own time frame. So they are not really synchronized and move at the same time, but they all have their own moment in time in this whole constellation, so that you can actually divide them apart in a certain way. Or you have to make an effort to make them look as if they collaborate.
I wonder if we could look at one of the pieces with these kelp-like elements, and if you could talk a little bit about these. So here, these are all vertical, correct me if I'm wrong, and here we have a sense of sort of elements falling rather than sort of a cut into the canvas. I wonder just if you could talk about these in relation to these pieces with the imposed branches that we've just been looking at.
Yeah, what I really like to do when I work is that once I get into one of those very strictly branch-like cut-in surfaces, almost like scars is what they leave once I take them off, that I think of what if it was different, you know, what if it was softer, or what if it was less controlled, because the branch nailed into the surface is a very controlled, very defined form that I insert into my process. So I was at the same time developing these works where I found outside or on the beach, I found driftwood or kelp or leftover things, and I would just come back with a huge bag of stuff and sprinkle it on top of the surface and see whether that could act as a filter against the spray, so that it kind of disperses the spray in a certain way and gives it a form, because actually the paint or the color lands on the surface. So I was looking at a counteractive force to my own image organization, which is a very easygoing folded line in a sense. And I wanted to contradict that line, or wanted to bring something into the painting that would at the same time coexist with that first structure, the repetitive structure, and would insert something that was completely non-repetitive.
This is also painted horizontally on the floor, correct?
That is right, yeah.
And so here you've dispersed the materials. You haven't pinned them down. These are sort of loosely dispersed, and they're not fastened to the surface before you then paint, correct?
Yeah, they're ever so slightly fastened, maybe with needles or very little effort, you know, so.
Okay.
And also the way they are fastened, you can see that they are sometimes very loose, so that the paint actually slips under the structure, or they have sometimes multidimensional contours where the colors are defining the forms from different angles. Sometimes they are really, really covering the surface, and you can see the white come through. And the white, in this case, coming through, has far more also the effect of light or of erasure, rather than of an object that had cut or somehow torn the surface apart, like in the paintings in the first space.
So the white there is where there was an element that was painted over. You've taken that away, and so we just see the primed canvas.
Yeah, that is right. So you have very different moments of disruption in these paintings. So there is far more gradual change within the disruption than it is in the other paintings that we saw in the first space. So what you could here also imagine that the disruption maybe is something that came later than the painting, or so there is a back and forth competition, if you will, about existence or being present of either the disruptive net structure or the painted gradient.
Yeah, and the materials that you're using here, again, the trace of that dispersed kelp and other materials is more active, more in motion compared to, again, those very static branches that you describe as cuts. It also strikes me, and correct me if I'm wrong, at least looking at this painting that we have before us, that there's a more vibrant palette in these. Is that the case, or no? I'm just looking at this one painting and thinking that.
No, I think that is exactly true. I was exactly looking into my color scheme with these paintings, and that was actually the set out for the whole group of works, because I came from the large installation at Hamburger Bahnhof, which I had finished in June last year, and the colors were extremely vibrant. It was, to a huge extent, a floor piece with sculptural elements in it, but the floor piece gave me a lot of new thoughts about how I use color. And I decided I wanted to try out if I could use within one painting a larger scale from vibrant to dusty or muddy or maybe even dirty or non-defined, even to the extent which you can see here on the left side of the painting, where you even think maybe it's just dust or crumble and not even a definition coming from a very regular movement of the gun. And yeah, I really enjoyed those different versions of looseness and fastness, and also, as you put it, the idea of maybe even velocity or being in motion. So it's not very clear. Is that maybe a system that is about to organize itself any minute in a new way? So that was something that was very surprising to me, and also that the forms, the different items that were on the canvas, seen from far away, you could even think that is maybe a skeleton that's dancing, or there are all these associations are possible as well, and I thought that was really very intriguing.
Yeah, and together with that, when I look at this now, you see what we were referring to earlier on the left edge and in the top left corner, this kind of puckering or these ripples of the canvas from when it was loose, unstretched, and the paint settled, and now that it's been stretched. So this similar sort of push and pull, as you're describing it, between looseness and a kind of tautness. So you see that there as well as in sort of the composition of the work as you've been discussing it.
Yeah, I had the feeling that the painting gets animated. And the animation is not coming from a nervous body movement or, the idea that my body kind of is a seismograph of certain other vibrations, but the animation comes from a lot of different associations that drift into the work by very, very simple painterly means, which is that you put some paint or color on and that you erase it in certain areas or stop it from showing itself, and by blending something out and blending something in, all of a sudden a constellation comes together that it has nothing to do with my body movement at all, but the movement comes from other grades of maybe possible thoughts or meaning, be it the dust versus the colorfulness, or being the notion of the ever so slightly figurative association with something that's disruptive and abstract. So yeah, that brilliant ambiguity of what I look at all the time, be it a table or the sun coming up behind the bush, I can really decide what I want to see. Do I want to see that interference between all the different elements? That's what I see here in a certain way. Or do I want to see nameable objects like sun, bush, foot, face, etc. And I'm actually more interested in the interferential face.
Yeah, great. I wonder, looking at this as we're discussing, I'm thinking of the cut canvases. This seems to be in dialogue with, generated out of, a lot of the things you've been discussing. Of course, the work is very different in that it's been cut, it's in fragments, it's loosely hanging. Here we have this really vibrant, intense color, however, that is cut through, and we see this expansive white wall. But so I'd love to hear from you sort of how this work now is fitting in with some of the things that we've just been examining.
Yeah, what is really interesting for me as a painter, when I make them, I totally give in to the notion of, I think I would now like to cut a couple of different sized canvases, and then I put 3 or 4 on top of one another, and then I cut through the first layer, the second layer, see how the 2 layers cut relate to one another. What is the outcome at the end, the curly bits that hang down, So I don't really organize strategically what I do, but now when I install the show, I do have a totally different relationship to the work, and I can somehow see also relations between the works. So as if the branch that had been nailed on the surface all of a sudden develops its own, spiel, and then cuts maybe through and disappears. So yeah, there are these, I have sometimes the feeling that I'm enacting directions that I'm being inspired by the objects, so the branch that cuts through something, that actually travels through the surface, and maybe I just give in and do these things, and when I step back, I see, yeah, there is actually a real relationship also with these curly, very tender interferences that we just looked at. If you look at them as in a process of being more materialized, more crystallized, maybe they are able to become curls, or, you know, so it's more like as if these are next thoughts to the other canvases.
So it's sort of like you channel the will of the constellation of elements that you're working with a little bit.
Yeah, I think I have developed a certain body intelligence, probably. That's why I'm also so fascinated by painting, because I think it is, the decision process is kind of happening on so many layers and levels of your system. I don't think it is just, or in my case at least, it's not a concept that I put down on paper and then I follow that. Can be as well, but very often I'm following touch and movement and speed, and also collateral thoughts coming together at the same time, and I very often let them happen also at the same time in the canvas.
With these works also, it's interesting to me because the cut, it seems, at one and the same time, of course, obstructs, it takes away the field of color, the field of painting. We have the white wall rather than the painted field, but it also accelerates the color in a certain way. There's a kind of new energy that is created through these multiple layers, through this unexpected then sort of overlapping or rippling of color. I wonder if, as I describe it that way, that makes sense to you as a painter?
Yeah, I think these slashes, they dramatize and actualize the fields of the color far more, and also they connect whatever is visible as a painted area far more with the wall. You know, I think it is the relationship this painting has with the surrounding is very interesting, and it could even hang on a blue wall, or, you know, on something where there is a pattern behind it. I think that would be very interesting. It has the ability to communicate with its surrounding in a very, very dramatic way, and it's also this combination of something is torn and maybe even destructively hurt or damaged, and at the same time a new form comes about out of that same destructive process that has so many new possibilities in it.
Yeah, that's great. As I hear you say that, and I think we're running out of time, that seems like maybe an appropriate place to wrap up. Also, because very nicely you've ended, you began by talking about your production of these works in a certain environment. And you've ended by talking about then, in this case, these works sort of heading out into the world. And as they are shown in different environments, new things are animated, new things come into being. Whatever the color of the wall is, whatever the context, the room, the environment in which they're shown. So that constellation of elements with which you work sort of carries over now into this constellation of elements within which the paintings continue to live, which I think makes sense when I think of your practice across the board. Thanks so much for talking again, Katharina.
Thank you, Graham.